My own sister stood in a Fulton County courtroom, placed her hand on a Bible and swore I was mentally unstable, just so my ex-husband could steal half my company. I spent the next year building a real estate technology empire in absolute silence. So when she showed up at the gates of my new $4 million Buckhead mansion with a moving truck and her arrogant hedge fund husband demanding to move in, I did not just shut the door. I set a trap that would completely dismantle their perfect fake lives by the end of the week. If you have ever been the black sheep of a family obsessed with high society status, stay tuned. You will want to hear every single detail of what I did next. The pounding on my custom mahogany front door was so violent it echoed through the grand foyer of my new home. I was 34 years old, and I had just spent the last 3 hours unpacking crystal glassware in my chef's kitchen. I was wearing old sweatpants and a messy bun, finally breathing free air after a divorce that had nearly broken me. I wiped the dust off my hands and walked toward the entryway, checking the security tablet mounted on the wall. My stomach dropped, but I did not panic. Standing on my front porch, flanked by her 3 perfectly dressed children and a massive moving truck parked aggressively in my circular driveway, was my older sister Jasmine. Beside her stood her husband Preston, wearing his signature fleece vest over a button-down shirt, the unofficial uniform of entitled finance executives everywhere. I opened the heavy door just enough to stand in the threshold, blocking their view of the marble floors and sweeping staircase behind me. Jasmine did not even offer a greeting. She simply pushed her designer sunglasses up into her perfectly styled hair and sighed heavily. "Open the security gates wider, Aliyah," she commanded, gesturing impatiently toward the street. "The moving guys cannot back the truck in properly. And tell whoever is inside to start moving your boxes out of the master suite. Preston needs the space for his home office setup." I looked at the stack of matching designer luggage sitting on my porch, then looked at her. "I am sorry," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Are you lost?" "Do not play stupid with me," Jasmine snapped, shifting her handbag on her shoulder. "Mom and Dad already made the decision. They told us you bought this place last week. Since you humiliated this family with that messy public divorce from Terrence, the least you can do is make yourself useful. Our house in Alpharetta is undergoing a massive renovation, and Preston cannot be expected to live in a hotel for 6 months. Mom said you owe us this for dragging our family name through the mud in front of the entire country club." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the humid Atlanta air. My parents, Richard and Vivian, were obsessed with their image in the African-American elite circles of the city. They spent their weekends hosting charity galas and their evenings managing high society politics. To them, my divorce from a slick wealth manager like Terrence was a tragedy that reflected poorly on their pristine reputation. But Jasmine, marrying a white hedge fund manager like Preston, was treated like the ultimate victory, a permanent ticket into circles of old money my parents desperately wanted to access. They catered to Preston's every whim, treating him like royalty, while treating me like an embarrassing inconvenience that needed to be swept under the rug. I let out a harsh laugh that made her children take a step back. "Family is an accident of biology, Jasmine. You stopped being my family the minute you chose Terrence's bank account over my livelihood. You stood in that courtroom wearing a suit bought with my hard-earned money and lied through your teeth. You are not stepping 1 foot onto this property. If that moving truck is not off my driveway in 2 minutes, I am calling the police and having you all removed for trespassing." That was when Preston finally stepped forward. He had been standing slightly behind Jasmine, watching the exchange with an amused, condescending smirk on his face. He stepped up to my porch, using his tall frame to try and intimidate me, carrying the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "Listen here, little sister," Preston said, his voice dripping with smooth Wall Street arrogance. "Let us drop the angry independent woman act. We all know you only got this house because you hid money during the divorce. Your parents know it, Jasmine knows it, and more importantly, Terrence knows it." He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper. He did not hand it to me. He aggressively slapped it against my chest, forcing me to catch it before it fell to the ground. "You do not own this house," Aliyah, Preston said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Terrence filed an emergency property lien on this estate at 9 o'clock this morning. He found out you were using a shell company to hide marital assets. As of right now, this property is legally contested and frozen. You have absolutely no right to deny us entry, because technically half of this dirt belongs to the man you tried to cheat. So I suggest you start packing your bags and find a nice quiet apartment somewhere. We are moving in. I slowly unfolded this document. It was indeed a notice of a property lien filed by Terrence's high-powered legal team, citing hidden assets and demanding immediate seizure of the property pending a court hearing. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought this piece of paper was a death sentence to the new life I was building. Preston stood there looking triumphant, expecting me to break down in tears, expecting me to beg for mercy, or fly into the exact type of emotional rage they had falsely accused me of in court. Jasmine was already motioning for her kids to start walking up the steps. But I did not cry. I did not scream. I looked down at the document, read the name of the brokerage firm that had underwritten the claim, and felt a surge of absolute power course through my veins. They had no idea what they had just handed me. They had no idea that by filing this specific piece of paper, Terrence had just walked blindly into a trap I had laid months ago. I looked back up at Preston, whose smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw the icy calm in my eyes. "You really think a piece of paper from Terrence changes anything?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded complete attention. "You think because my parents worship the ground you walk on, that gives you the right to show up at my home and claim it as your own?" "It is the law!" Aaliyah Preston scoffed, gesturing broadly at the estate. "You played a dirty game during the divorce and you got caught. Terrence is just taking back what is rightfully his. And since we are family, he has graciously agreed to let us occupy the property to ensure it is maintained, while the courts sort out your little fraud scheme. Mom and Dad are completely on board. They agree it is the most responsible way to handle this embarrassing situation you have created." The betrayal ran so deep it was almost poetic. My own parents had blessed this invasion. They had likely coordinated with Terrence and Preston, deciding that my success was a threat to their carefully maintained social hierarchy. In their minds, I was supposed to be the broken divorced failure, living in a cramped condo, while Jasmine reigned supreme in a mansion. Seeing me buy a $4 million estate in Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhood had shattered their narrative. They needed to tear me down to restore their twisted sense of order. Jasmine crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. "Are you done throwing a tantrum?" she asked mockingly. "The moving crew charges by the hour, and Preston's investors are not going to wait. Move your car out of the garage so we can start unloading." I carefully folded the lien document and slipped it into the pocket of my sweatpants. I took one step forward, forcing Preston to take a half step back to maintain his personal space. "I am going to give you a piece of advice, Preston," I said, keeping my tone deadly even. "Because unlike you, I actually built my wealth from the ground up, instead of relying on family connections and shady favors. When you try to corner someone, you better make absolutely sure you know who owns the walls closing in around you." I pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. I tapped the security application that controlled the heavy iron gates at the entrance of the driveway. I pressed the close button. With a loud mechanical hum, the massive gates began to slide shut, completely locking their moving truck inside my property perimeter. "What are you doing?" Jasmine shrieked, her eyes darting toward the closing gates. "I am calling the police," I replied calmly, dialing the numbers on my screen. "I am reporting a home invasion by a group of trespassers who are attempting to use a fraudulently filed legal document to gain entry to my private residence. Let us see how your hedge fund investors feel when your mugshot hits the local news for trespassing and attempted extortion." Preston's face drained of its arrogant color. "You would not dare," he warned, his voice losing its smooth edge. "Your parents will disown you completely. They will ruin your reputation in this city." "They already tried," I said, stepping back and gripping the handle of my heavy front door. "And they failed. You have exactly until the police arrive to figure out how to back that truck out of my driveway. Have a wonderful afternoon." I slammed the heavy door shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. I locked the deadbolt and leaned against the cool wood, listening to Jasmine's muffled screaming from the porch. They thought this was the end of me. They thought this lien was my destruction. But as I pulled the folded document from my pocket and looked at the signature of Terrence's brokerage firm, a genuine terrifying smile spread across my face. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to destroy them all. The heavy mahogany doors of the Buckhead Heritage Club swung open. I walked past the concierge without waiting for an escort. The air inside smelled of aged bourbon and generations of exclusive privilege. This was the exact kind of place my parents worshipped. A fortress of old money where deals were made over rare steaks and imported scotch. I spotted Terrence immediately. He was sitting in a plush leather booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was wearing his tailored navy suit, flashing that same practiced smile he used to charm my parents. Beside him sat two older white men in expensive golf attire. They were exactly the type of investors Terrence spent his entire career trying to impress. I did not slow my pace. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, demanding attention from every table I passed. When Terrence finally noticed my approach, his perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His jaw tightened, but he quickly recovered, standing up to pull out an empty chair. He was always putting on a show for his wealthy audience. "Sloan, my dear," he said, loud enough for his clients to hear. "What an unexpected surprise." I did not take the offered chair. I stood looking down at him and his guests. I kept my voice perfectly pleasant and measured. "Hello, Terrence. I hope I am not interrupting your pitch, but we have a rather urgent legal matter to discuss. It concerns the paperwork you sent to my house this morning." The two investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them cleared his throat and checked his heavy gold watch. "We should probably hit the back nine anyway, Terrence. We can review those portfolio projections next week." Terrence practically shoved them toward the exit, apologizing profusely and promising to call them later. The moment they were out of earshot, his charming facade vanished completely. He sank back into the leather booth and glared at me. "Are you out of your mind, Sloan?" he hissed, leaning across the table. "Those men control a $50 million fund. You do not just storm into my club and ruin a business lunch because you are upset about a piece of paper." I finally took a seat, sliding gracefully into the chair opposite him. I flagged down a passing waiter and ordered a glass of their most expensive Cabernet. Then I turned my attention back to my ex-husband. "You mean the piece of paper where you filed a fraudulent lien against my property? The one you used to send my sister and her arrogant husband to my doorstep like a pack of rabid dogs?" Terrence let out a low, mocking laugh. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself. "It is not fraudulent, Sloan. You bought a $4 million estate right after our divorce was finalized. You obviously hid marital assets while we were in court. My lawyers are going to tear your finances apart. I am going to take that house and everything else you built while we were married." I rested my hands on the table. "You and I both know you do not want to live in that house, Terrence. You are making a play. So let us skip the posturing and get straight to the point. What do you actually want?" His eyes gleamed with raw, predatory ambition. It was the same look he had the day he convinced the judge to give him 40% of my initial startup capital. He leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "I want the algorithm." I raised an eyebrow. "The algorithm?" "Do not play dumb with me," he snapped. "Your real estate tech firm developed a proprietary algorithm that predicts commercial property value fluctuations before the market shifts. My brokerage firm is bleeding clients right now. We are down 20% this quarter. If I bring that software to my senior partners, I secure my position as a managing director. So here's the deal. You transfer the sole ownership of that code to me, and I will drop the lien. You get to keep your beautiful house and I get the promotion. Everyone wins." The waiter arrived, setting my glass of Cabernet gently on the table. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich flavor. The sheer arrogance of this man was almost impressive. He genuinely believed he held all the cards. He thought he could bully me into handing over my life's work just to protect the roof over my head. I set the wine glass down and reached into my designer handbag. I did not bring out the lien document he had given Preston. Instead, I pulled out a thick, certified folder bearing the official seal of the State Real Estate Commission. I slid it across the polished mahogany table directly into his hands. You really should learn to do your due diligence before you send your lawyers to attack people, Terrence. I said, my voice soft but razor sharp. Open it. Terrence frowned, looking at the folder with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He flipped it open and began scanning the first page. I watched his eyes track across the legal jargon. I watched the exact moment his confidence shattered. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a sudden sickening realization. What is this? He whispered, his eyes darting frantically across the text. This says the property is owned by a blind trust. I smiled, folding my hands together. That is correct. I do not own the Buckhead mansion. A private holding company owns it, and that company is completely shielded by an irrevocable blind trust. I am merely listed as the primary beneficiary and tenant. The assets used to purchase that home were legally acquired through a completely separate venture capital funding round that occurred after our divorce was finalized. You have absolutely no legal claim to it. Terrence swallowed hard, staring at the paperwork. Fine, he muttered, trying to recover his footing. So I withdraw the lien. You still cannot touch me. Oh, but I can, Terrence. I leaned in closer, ensuring he heard every single word. Because you did not just file a baseless lien against your ex-wife. You filed a lien against a protected trust. And if you turn to page 3, you will see exactly who underwrote the multi-million-dollar loan for that trust. Terrence flipped the page. His breath hitched. His hands began to tremble so violently the paper shook. The underwriting institution listed on the document was his own employer, the very same elite brokerage firm he worked for. You filed a hostile lien against one of your own firm's highest-tier VIP clients, I explained, watching the terror wash over his features. You used your position to access confidential property registry systems. You initiated a legal attack on an entity that your senior partners are actively doing business with, all because you wanted to extort me for a software algorithm. That is a direct violation of federal securities laws, Terrence. I kept my voice dangerously level. It is a massive breach of fiduciary duty. If I make one single phone call to your senior managing partner, or better yet, to the Federal Regulatory Commission, you will not just lose your job today. You will be stripped of your broker's license permanently. You will never work in the finance sector again. And you might even face federal charges for attempted corporate extortion. Terrence looked like he was going to vomit right there in the country club dining room. The polished, successful wealth manager persona was completely gone. He was sweating profusely, pulling at the collar of his expensive shirt as if he was suddenly suffocating. He looked around the room frantically, as if expecting security to drag him away right then and there. "Sloan, please," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You cannot do this. If you make that call, I lose everything. My reputation in Atlanta will be destroyed. I will be ruined." "You should have thought about your reputation before you tried to steal my company," I replied, picking up my wine glass again. "You have 24 hours to formally retract that lien and issue a written apology to my legal team. If you do not, I burn your career to the ground." I expected him to beg. I expected him to grovel and plead for mercy. But desperate men are dangerous. As Terrence realized he was completely trapped in a corner, his panic suddenly morphed into something dark and malicious. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and let out a dry, raspy laugh. He tossed the folder back onto the table. "You think you are so smart, do you not, Sloan?" He sneered, his eyes narrowing with pure hatred. "You think you hold all the power now because you outplayed me on a real estate technicality. But you do not know half of what is actually going on in your own family." I remained silent, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking worried. I just stared at him, waiting for whatever pathetic threat he was about to try next. "Go ahead and ruin my career," Terrence whispered, leaning across the table with a venomous grin. "Make the call. But before you do, you might want to take a very close look at your mother Vivian and her prestigious youth charity fund. Because Preston did not just show up at your house today to play the big strong brother-in-law. His hedge fund is completely underwater. He has been facing massive margin calls for months, and your parents are terrified of him losing his status in the white financial community." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face entirely blank. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked coldly. Terrence smiled, showing all his teeth. "Because Preston needed a massive influx of cash to cover his failing positions. And your parents let him use the family charity fund as collateral to secure a desperate loan. But they needed a guarantor with liquid assets to make it work. Someone with a successful tech company. Someone whose name looks really good on paper. He paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. Preston forged your signature, Sloan, Terrence whispered maliciously. He forged your name as the primary guarantor on his failing hedge fund debt. If Preston goes bankrupt, the bank takes your company to pay his debts. And when the federal investigators look into where the charity money went, you will be listed as the primary co-conspirator. If I go down today, Sloan, you are going straight to federal prison with the rest of your trash family. Terrence leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms once again. Your move, CEO. Let us see how smart you really are. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft hum of a live jazz quartet filled the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons. My mother Vivian was in her element, wearing a custom emerald gown that probably cost more than the average starting salary of the underprivileged youth her charity foundation claimed to support. She was holding court among Atlanta's black elite, effortlessly swapping fake smiles and hollow compliments with local politicians and real estate moguls. My father Richard stood right beside her, projecting the image of the ultimate power couple. I did not bother grabbing a drink from the passing waiters. I walked straight through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares from aunts and family friends who had not seen me since the divorce. I stepped directly into my parents' circle of sycophants. "Excuse me," I said, my voice slicing through my mother's practiced laughter. "I need to borrow my parents for a moment. It is a private family matter." Vivian's smile tightened, her eyes flashing with immediate annoyance, but she maintained her poised facade for the guests. "Of course, darling," she murmured, excusing herself gracefully. Richard followed us, his jaw already clenched. I led them away from the glittering chandeliers and the prying eyes, down a quiet, carpeted corridor and into an empty VIP lounge, shutting the heavy oak doors behind us. The muffled sound of the jazz band faded, leaving only the tense silence of the room. "What is the meaning of this, Sloan?" my father demanded, straightening his tailored tuxedo jacket. "You do not just storm into our annual gala looking like you are ready to start a brawl. You are embarrassing us in front of the mayor." "I am embarrassing you?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Not the fact that your golden son-in-law is currently drowning in margin calls. Not the fact that you allowed him to use this very charity foundation to secure a desperate loan for his failing hedge fund." Vivian's face drained of all color. Her hand flew to her pearl necklace, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, looking frantically at the closed door. "What are you talking about?" "Do not play the ignorant housewife with me, Mom," I said, stepping closer to them. "I just had a very enlightening conversation with Terrence at the country club. I know Preston forged my signature as the primary guarantor on his debt. I know my name is sitting on fraudulent bank documents linking my tech company to your illegal embezzlement scheme." Richard did not look shocked. He did not look ashamed. Instead, his features twisted into a mask of pure aggressive hostility. He took a step toward me, using his physical presence to try and force me to back down. It was a tactic he had used my entire life to keep me in line. "You listen to me very carefully," he growled, his voice dropping to a menacing octave. "You are a part of this family, and you will do exactly what is required to protect it. Preston made a slight miscalculation in the market. It happens to the best money managers. We are simply giving him the runway he needs to correct it." "A miscalculation," I repeated, staring at him in absolute disbelief. "He forged my signature on federal financial documents to steal from a charity fund meant for Black youth in our community. He committed multiple felonies, and you are treating it like a bad day at the golf course." Vivian stepped forward, her tone laced with that familiar condescending poison. "You have always been so dramatic, Sloan, always so eager to play the victim and tear down your sister's happiness. Preston is a good man going through a rough patch. We used your name because your tech company has the liquid assets to satisfy the underwriters. It is a temporary hold. You will not lose a single dime if you just keep your mouth shut and cooperate." I let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. "You expect me to absorb a multi-million-dollar fraudulent debt to save the ego of a mediocre white finance bro who looks down on you behind closed doors?" "He does not look down on us," Richard shouted, his composure finally breaking. "Preston is the gold standard of this family. Do you have any idea how much old money white investment capital he brings into my firm? His connections are the only reason we secured the downtown commercial zoning contracts last year. His presence legitimizes us in rooms where we would normally be shut out. I stared at my father, feeling a profound sense of disgust. You are selling out your own daughter to buy proximity to white wealth. I shook my head slowly. I am not signing anything. I am not validating that forged document, and I am certainly not handing over my house to pay off his bad bets. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You selfish, ungrateful little brat. You think you are so superior with your startup company. Let me remind you how this family operates. When Jasmine failed the bar exam for the third time, I donated $100,000 to the licensing board's favored charity just to save face and keep her reputation spotless. We protect our own. You will take this debt to protect your sister's husband, or I will personally call every contact I have and ruin your business in this city. I will make sure no venture capitalist in Atlanta ever takes a meeting with you again. The threat hung heavily in the air. For a moment, the room was completely silent. They expected me to cave. They expected the old Sloane, the daughter who used to crave their approval, to surrender and take the fall. I looked my father dead in the eye. Try it, I whispered coldly. You make one move against my company and I will send the forged documents directly to the IRS and the FBI. Enjoy your gala. I turned on my heel and walked out of the VIP lounge, leaving them standing in stunned silence. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline was making my hands shake, but I refused to let it show. I needed air. I needed to get out of the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. I bypassed the main event hall and found a set of glass French doors leading out to a secluded stone balcony. The crisp night air of Atlanta hit my face, instantly cooling my flushed skin. I walked to the edge of the stone railing, gripping it tightly as I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to process the magnitude of my parents' betrayal. They were willing to send me to federal prison just to protect Preston's image. Before I could fully compose myself, the sound of angry, hushed voices drifted from the darkened corner of the balcony. The space was L-shaped, and the voices were coming from just around the brick partition hidden in the shadows. I froze, instantly recognizing the panicked, frantic tone of my ex-husband. I am telling you, she knows everything, Preston. Terrence's voice was shaking, thick with desperation. She ambushed me at the club. She knew the house was in a blind trust, and she knew my firm underwrote it. She threatened to call the Regulatory Commission and have my broker's license stripped by the end of the day if I do not drop the property lien. I cannot afford to lose my license, man. You have to back off. A loud thud echoed in the dark as if someone had just been shoved hard against the brick wall. I do not care about your damn license, Terrence. Preston hissed, his voice dripping with pure venom. I am $12 million in the hole on margin calls. The bank is threatening to seize my assets by Friday. I need that Buckhead mansion liquidated right now to cover my positions. You promised me that lien would force her to settle and give up the property. She outsmarted us, Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking. She is 2 steps ahead. We need to find another way to get the cash. I cannot risk a federal investigation. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold stone wall, inching closer to the edge of the partition to hear every word. There is no other way, Preston growled, stepping closer to Terrence. You are going to maintain that lien and you are going to force her out of that house. Because if Sloane does not surrender the house to pay off my margin calls by tomorrow morning, I am releasing the hotel security tape of you and Jasmine. The silence that followed was deafening. I stopped breathing entirely. Terrence let out a choked, panicked gasp. You promised you destroyed that footage. If that gets out, Jasmine will lose everything. Her parents will cut her off. My career will actually be over. Preston let out a cold, cruel chuckle. Did you really think I would not keep an insurance policy on my own wife? You get me that house, Terrence, or I play that video of you screwing my wife on the projector screens in there for all of Atlanta high society to watch. Do your job. Footsteps echoed as Preston stormed away, leaving Terrence breathing heavily in the dark. I stood frozen against the brick wall, my mind racing as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. I pressed my hand over my mouth to silence the sharp gasp trying to escape my throat. The cold reality of the situation washed over me like a bucket of ice water. The golden child, the perfect sister who had stood in a courtroom and sworn I was crazy during my divorce. She had not done it out of blind loyalty to a brother-in-law or some twisted family dynamic. She had done it to protect her own filthy secret, my sister and my ex-husband. The betrayal was so profound it almost made me dizzy. I slowly backed away from the partition, slipping quietly back through the glass French doors into the bustling hallway. The jazz music swelled around me again, but I could not hear it. A new, entirely different kind of war had just begun. I did not wait for the valet to bring my car around. I walked straight down the sweeping driveway of the Four Seasons Hotel, my emerald dress brushing the concrete. The valet handed me the keys to my car, and I slid into the driver's seat, pulling out into the Atlanta night, before the door was even fully shut. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, but my mind was completely clear. I connected my phone to the dashboard system and dialed a number I had kept saved for emergencies. It belonged to a private investigator named Silas. He was a former federal agent who operated entirely outside the polite social circles my parents worshipped. He did not care about country club memberships or charity galas. He only cared about results, and he charged a premium for absolute discretion. Silas answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. I told him I needed a full forensic sweep on 2 men starting immediately. I gave him the names of my ex-husband and my arrogant brother-in-law. I told him to look into every bank account, every wire transfer, and every margin call associated with the hedge fund. Then I gave him the most crucial piece of information. I told him to pull every piece of security footage from every luxury hotel in the metropolitan area from exactly 4 years ago. I needed to know what Preston was holding over Terrence. Silas simply quoted his retainer fee and hung up. I transferred $50,000 to his account before I even reached my driveway. The real war started the next morning. I walked into the glass-lobbied headquarters of my real estate technology firm at exactly 7 o'clock. The air in the office was thick with tension. My executive assistant met me at the elevator bank holding a stack of tablets and looking physically ill. She told me the board of directors had called an emergency meeting and they were already waiting for me in the main conference room. I did not need to ask why. Preston had already made his move. I knew I overheard his extortion attempt on the balcony, and he was using his network of old money white investors to try and bleed me dry before I could expose him. I pushed open the frosted glass doors of the conference room. 5 of my senior board members were sitting around the long table, looking like they were preparing for a funeral. The lead investor, a man who played golf with Preston every single weekend, did not even bother to stand when I entered. He tossed a financial portfolio onto the center of the table and stared at me with pure condescension. He told me that 3 of our major venture capital backers had pulled their funding overnight. He claimed they received anonymous tips regarding my character and my supposed mental instability during my divorce. He said the investors felt my leadership was too erratic and that my personal family drama was becoming a massive liability to the company valuation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He told me that the board had drafted a separation agreement. They wanted me to step down as chief executive officer immediately and hand over operational control to a management group of their choosing. If I refused, he promised they would liquidate their shares and bankrupt the company by noon. It was a classic corporate smear campaign orchestrated by a man who thought he could starve me into submission. Preston was trying to force me to surrender my personal assets to save his hedge fund by holding my professional life hostage. I walked slowly to the head of the table. I did not sit down. I looked at the 5 men who thought they held my future in their hands, and I felt a profound sense of pity for their ignorance. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single flash drive, setting it down next to their ridiculous separation agreement. I told them they were operating under the false assumption that I needed their local funding to keep my lights on. I reminded them that I built the core algorithm of this company entirely by myself while sleeping on a mattress on the floor after my ex-husband tried to ruin me the first time. I never trusted the local network of favors and country club handshakes. I tapped the flash drive. I told the board that for the past 6 months I had been secretly negotiating a massive independent contract with an international property development conglomerate based out of Tokyo. a conglomerate that had absolutely zero ties to the Atlanta society circles my parents and my brother-in-law desperately clung to. I informed them that the contract had been finalized and signed at 4 in the morning. The international firm had purchased a 10-year licensing agreement for our proprietary software. The initial deposit alone was worth $80 million, and it had already cleared our corporate accounts. The color drained from the lead investor's face. The other board members scrambled to pull up the banking applications on their tablets. When they saw the $80 million deposit sitting safely in the company treasury, the room went dead silent. I looked at the man who had just demanded my resignation. I told him he had exactly 2 hours to pack his office and remove himself from my board. I told them all that if any of them ever tried to leverage my personal life to orchestrate a corporate coup, again I would personally ensure they never sat on another board in this country. I watched them file out of the room like scolded children, their threats of bankruptcy completely neutralized. Preston had tried to cut off my oxygen, but he had no idea I had already bought the entire atmosphere. I returned to my private office and closed the blinds, letting the quiet hum of the city settle around me. I had successfully defended my company, but the family war was far from over. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stared out at the sprawling skyline, wondering what my sister and her husband were planning next. The private elevator chimed, indicating a direct arrival to my floor. Silas walked into my office without knocking. He looked exactly like a man who had not slept in 24 hours. His suit was wrinkled, and he carried a battered leather messenger bag over his shoulder. He did not offer a polite greeting. He walked straight to my desk and dropped a thick, heavy manila file directly onto the center of my glass desk. The file landed with a heavy thud that made my coffee ripple. I asked him if he found the margin call records for the hedge fund. Silas nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me he found the exact dollar amount Preston was hiding from his investors and the exact forged documents tying my name to the charity fund. He said he had already forwarded the financial discrepancies to my lawyer Jordan so we could prepare the legal defense. But Silas did not look triumphant. He looked deeply disturbed. He reached out and tapped the thick folder with his index finger. He told me the financial fraud was only half of the story. He said he had pulled the security footage from the luxury hotel just like I asked. He traced the dates matching the timeline of my divorce proceedings and the perjury my sister committed in court. I reached for the folder, my fingers brushing against the rough paper. I asked him if the footage showed Terrence blackmailing my brother-in-law. Silas shook his head slowly, looking me dead in the eye. He told me I needed to prepare myself before I opened that file. He leaned over my desk, his voice dropping to a low, serious gravel. You thought your ex-husband just wanted your money. It is much sicker than that. I did not wait for the valet to bring my car around. I walked straight down the sweeping driveway of the Four Seasons Hotel, my emerald dress brushing the concrete. Pulling out into the Atlanta night. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, but my mind was completely clear. I dialed a number I kept saved for absolute emergencies. It belonged to a private investigator named Silas. He was a former federal agent who operated entirely outside the polite social circles my parents worshipped. He only cared about results and charged a premium for absolute discretion. Silas answered, his voice rough with sleep. I told him I needed a full forensic sweep on 2 men starting immediately. I gave him the names of my ex-husband and my arrogant brother-in-law. I told him to look into every bank account, every wire transfer, and every margin call associated with the hedge fund. Then I gave him the most crucial piece of information. I told him to pull every piece of security footage from every luxury hotel in the metropolitan area from exactly 4 years ago. I needed to know what Preston was holding over Terrence. Silas simply quoted his retainer fee and hung up. I transferred $50,000 to his account before I even reached my driveway. The real war started the next morning. I walked into the headquarters of my real estate technology firm at exactly 7 o'clock. The air in the office was thick with a suffocating tension. My executive assistant met me at the elevator bank looking physically ill. She told me the board of directors had called an emergency meeting and they were already waiting in the main conference room. I did not need to ask why. Preston had already made his move. He knew I overheard his extortion attempt, and he was using his network of old money investors to bleed me dry before I could expose him. I pushed open the frosted glass doors. 5 of my senior board members were sitting around the mahogany table, looking like they were preparing for an execution. The lead investor, a man who played golf with Preston every weekend, did not even bother to stand. He tossed a heavy financial portfolio onto the table and stared at me with pure condescension. He told me that 3 of our major venture capital backers had pulled their funding overnight. He claimed they received anonymous tips regarding my supposed mental instability during my divorce. He said the investors felt my personal family drama was becoming a massive liability to the company valuation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He told me the board had drafted a separation agreement. They wanted me to step down as chief executive officer immediately and hand over operational control. If I refused, he promised they would liquidate their shares and bankrupt the company by noon. It was a classic corporate smear campaign orchestrated by a man who thought he could starve me into submission. Preston was trying to force me to surrender my personal assets to save his hedge fund by holding my professional life hostage. I walked slowly to the head of the table but did not sit down. I looked at the 5 men who thought they held my future in their hands, and I felt a profound sense of pity for their ignorance. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single flash drive, setting it down next to their ridiculous separation agreement. I told them they were operating under the false assumption that I needed their local funding to keep my lights on. I reminded them that I built the core algorithm of this company entirely by myself. I never trusted the local network of favors and country club handshakes. I tapped the flash drive. I told the board that for the past 6 months I had been secretly negotiating a massive independent contract with an international property development conglomerate based out of Tokyo. A conglomerate with absolutely zero ties to the Atlanta society circles my parents desperately clung to. I informed them the contract had been finalized and signed at 4 in the morning. The international firm had purchased a 10-year licensing agreement for our proprietary software. The initial deposit alone was worth $80 million, and it had already cleared our corporate accounts. The color drained from the lead investor's face. The other board members scrambled to pull up the banking applications on their tablets. When they saw the $80 million deposit sitting safely in the company treasury, the room went dead silent. I looked at the man who had just demanded my resignation. I told him he had exactly 2 hours to pack his office and remove himself from my board. I told them all that if any of them ever tried to leverage my personal life to orchestrate a corporate coup, again, I would personally ensure they never sat on another board in this country. I watched them file out of the room like scolded children, their threats completely neutralized. Preston had tried to cut off my oxygen, but he had no idea I had already bought the entire atmosphere. I returned to my private office and closed the blinds, letting the quiet hum of the city settle around me. I had successfully defended my company, but the family war was far from over. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stared out at the sprawling skyline, wondering what my sister and her husband were planning next. The private elevator chimed, indicating a direct arrival to my floor. Silas walked into my office without knocking. He looked exactly like a man who had not slept in 24 hours. His suit was wrinkled, and he carried a battered leather messenger bag over his shoulder. He walked straight to my desk and dropped a thick, heavy manila file directly onto the center of the glass. The file landed with a heavy thud that made my coffee ripple. I asked him if he found the margin call records for the hedge fund. Silas nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me he found the exact dollar amount Preston was hiding from his investors and the exact forged documents tying my name to the charity fund. He said he had already forwarded the financial discrepancies to my lawyer so we could prepare the legal defense against the bank. But Silas did not look triumphant. He looked deeply disturbed. He reached out and tapped the thick folder with his index finger. He told me the financial fraud was only half of the story. He said he had pulled the security footage from the luxury hotel just like I asked. He traced the dates matching the timeline of my divorce proceedings and the perjury my sister committed in court. I reached for the folder, my fingers brushing against the rough paper. I asked him if the footage showed Terrence blackmailing my brother-in-law. Silas shook his head slowly, looking me dead in the eye. He told me I needed to prepare myself before I opened that file. He leaned over my desk, his voice dropping to a low, serious gravel. You thought your ex-husband just wanted your money. It is much sicker than that. The heavy wrought iron gates of my parents' estate in Alpharetta swung open slowly, allowing my car to glide onto the pristine circular driveway. It was Sunday morning, and the Atlanta sun was already baking the manicured lawns that my father spent a fortune maintaining just to impress his wealthy neighbors. I parked my car next to Preston's luxury SUV, taking a moment to sit in the quiet of my own vehicle. My hands rested on the leather steering wheel. Sitting on the passenger seat next to me was a simple black leather tote bag. Inside that bag was my encrypted tablet, holding the massive forensic file Silas had dropped on my desk. I had spent the entire night wide awake staring at the security footage of my sister and my ex-husband sneaking into a hotel room 4 years ago. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest, but I refused to let it crush me. Instead, it had crystallized into pure focused strategy. I grabbed my bag and walked up the wide brick steps to the front door, prepared to step back into the snake pit. My mother, Vivian, had mandated this family Sunday brunch under the guise of family unity, following the disaster at the charity gala. She had texted me that my attendance was required because Jasmine had a special announcement. I knew exactly how these brunches operated. They were theatrical performances designed to reinforce the family hierarchy. I walked through the grand foyer and followed the sound of clinking crystal and polite laughter into the sunroom. The space was flooded with natural light, and the long dining table was covered in an absurd spread of catered food. Imported pastries, roasted salmon, and expensive champagne sat on silver platters. My family was gathered around the table, acting as if the events of the past few days had never happened. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table sipping a mimosa. He completely ignored my entrance, refusing to even look in my direction after I had threatened his precious reputation at the gala. Vivian looked up from her plate and offered a tight, strained smile, telling me I was late and that I should be grateful they saved me a seat. I did not argue or apologize. I simply walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table and sat down, placing my leather bag carefully on the floor next to my feet. Jasmine sat across from me, wearing a flowing white silk dress that draped perfectly over her figure. She looked radiant, playing the role of the flawless Southern society wife to absolute perfection. Next to her sat Preston. My white brother-in-law was wearing his typical weekend uniform of khaki slacks and a pastel polo shirt, looking incredibly relaxed for a man who was drowning in $12 million of fraudulent hedge fund debt. The sheer delusion in the room was suffocating. They were all actively ignoring the massive financial ruin hovering over Preston's head, choosing instead to pretend they were untouchable. Untouchable because they believed I would ultimately cave and pay his debts to save the family name. Jasmine leaned across the table, resting her chin on her hand, and offered me a look of pure condescending pity. She asked how my little tech startup was doing, implying that she already knew about the board mutiny Preston had tried to orchestrate. She said it must be so exhausting fighting battles all by myself in that big, empty house of mine. She added that maybe if I had a softer personality like hers, I would not be a lonely divorced woman pushing 35 with no real legacy to leave behind. I looked at my older sister, the woman who had stood in a courtroom and lied under oath to help Terrence steal my money. I looked at her smiling face, knowing she had been sleeping with my husband while playing the supportive sibling. I did not raise my voice or take the bait. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee and told her my business was doing better than ever and that my house was perfectly peaceful without toxic people breathing my air. Preston scoffed loudly, cutting his salmon with aggressive, jerky motions. He told me I was always so bitter and that I needed to learn how to be a team player. Richard murmured his agreement, praising Preston for his infinite wisdom and patience in dealing with a difficult woman like me. The gaslighting was relentless, a constant coordinated effort to make me feel small and crazy. But the files sitting in my bag kept me completely anchored to reality. Midway through the brunch, Jasmine suddenly stood up. She tapped her crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon, commanding the attention of the entire room. The chatter died down instantly. Jasmine placed a hand over her lower stomach and let out a dramatic trembling breath. Perfectly timed tears welled up in her eyes, making them shine in the morning sunlight. She looked at Preston with an expression of pure adoration and then turned to our parents. She announced to the table that she was pregnant with her fourth child. The dining room erupted into deafening, joyous applause. Vivian threw her hands in the air, praising God, and immediately started talking about reserving the country club for a massive baby shower. Richard stood up and walked around the table to pull Preston into a massive bear hug, congratulating him on expanding the family empire and securing their legacy. The entire room celebrated, ignoring me completely, as if I did not even exist. It was the ultimate display of their twisted priorities, celebrating the golden child's perfect fertility while turning a blind eye to her husband's federal crimes. Preston puffed out his chest, looking incredibly arrogant and pleased with himself. He wrapped his arm tightly around Jasmine's waist and kissed her cheek, playing the role of the proud patriarch. He raised his glass and boasted loudly to the table about his strong genetics. He made a disgusting, highly offensive joke about how his superior white lineage was exactly what this black family needed to ensure a generation of high society dominance and wealth. He claimed he was building an army of winners who would inherit the city. My parents ate up every single word. They nodded along, blindly worshiping this mediocre man solely because of his proximity to white institutional power and elite social circles. They toasted to his virility, to his perfect marriage, and to the brilliant future of their expanding family. I sat at the end of the table, perfectly still. The noise of their delusional celebration washed over me like static. I reached down into my leather tote bag and pulled out my encrypted tablet. I laid it flat on my lap, keeping it completely hidden beneath the heavy linen tablecloth so no one could see what I was doing. I entered my passcode and opened the secure file Silas, the private investigator, had sent me. It was not just the hotel security footage in that thick manila folder. Silas had pulled every medical record, every financial transaction, and every hidden secret tied to Preston's name. I bypassed the embezzlement proofs and tapped on a scanned medical document retrieved from a highly exclusive private clinic in Midtown Atlanta. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the clinical terminology and the undeniable dates printed in black and white. It was a surgical confirmation form. The patient name listed at the top was Preston. The procedure was an elective bilateral vasectomy. I checked the date of the operation, printed clearly next to the doctor's signature. The surgery took place exactly 3 years ago. The medical notes attached to the file confirmed the procedure was completely successful and irreversible without massive reconstructive surgery. I had already checked his subsequent medical records, and there was zero evidence he had ever attempted to reverse it. Preston had been sterile for 36 months. I looked up from the glowing screen and stared directly at my sister. She was glowing, soaking in the praise and the endless attention from our parents. She was carrying a child she actively claimed belonged to the arrogant hedge fund manager currently boasting about his strong genetics to anyone who would listen. But the math was absolute and unforgiving. Preston could not possibly father a child. There was only one other man who had been secretly sharing Jasmine's bed for the past 4 years. The man she committed perjury to protect, the man she betrayed her own sister for. Terrence, my slick, manipulative ex-husband, was the biological father of the golden child's new baby. The very same baby my parents were currently weeping tears of joy over. I did not stand up and scream. I did not throw my coffee cup or flip the dining table. That would be playing by their rules. That would allow them to paint me as the angry, unstable black sheep of the family who was just jealous of her sister's happiness. Instead, I just sat there and let a slow, genuine, and absolutely terrifying smile spread across my face. I raised my glass of sparkling water toward the happy couple, making sure my hand did not tremble even slightly. I looked deep into Jasmine's eyes and told her she was absolutely glowing. I said in a soft, measured voice that I was absolutely certain this new baby would bring exactly the kind of truth and clarity this family truly deserved. Preston smirked and thanked me, raising his glass in a mock salute, totally oblivious to the fact that his wife was carrying the child of another man. Vivian rolled her eyes at my cryptic words, brushing me off, and quickly turning her attention back to planning the catering for the baby shower. Richard did not even look at me. I lowered my glass and looked back down at the medical file resting on my lap, knowing with absolute certainty that I was holding the detonator to a bomb that would obliterate this entire family tree down to its very roots. The celebration around the long dining table was reaching a fever pitch. Vivian was already listing potential luxury caterers for the massive baby shower, while Richard ordered the household staff to bring out another bottle of vintage champagne from the cellar. Preston was holding Jasmine's hand, painting a vivid picture of their perfect future in my house. I carefully pressed the lock button on my tablet, watching the glowing screen go completely black. I slid the device back into my black leather tote bag and pushed it beneath my chair with the side of my foot. The dark truth about the vasectomy was safely tucked away for now. It was time to give them exactly what they wanted to see. It was time to play the role they had assigned to me since childhood. I took a deep breath, forcing my chest to heave slightly, as if I was struggling to pull air into my lungs. I dug my fingernails deep into my palms until the sharp physical sting made my eyes water. I let my shoulders slump heavily, dropping the confident defensive posture I had spent years building in the corporate world. I pushed my chair back, letting its heavy wooden legs scrape loudly against the marble floor. The harsh grinding sound cut right through the joyful chatter of the sunroom. The entire table stopped celebrating and turned to look at me. Preston glared, expecting me to start another argument. Jasmine let out a loud, annoyed sigh, clearly irritated that I was stealing the precious spotlight from her fabricated pregnancy announcement. I stood up, letting my hands tremble visibly at my sides. I looked directly at my father and allowed the first fake tear to spill over my eyelashes and roll slowly down my cheek. I let my voice crack, breaking the heavy silence with a pathetic, breathless whisper. I told them they won. I said I could not fight them anymore. I wrapped my arms around my own waist, swaying slightly, as if the invisible weight of the world was physically crushing me into the floor. I confessed that the investors had ambushed me at my office that morning, and that the intense stress of the corporate mutiny, combined with the terrifying threat of federal prison, was simply too much for me to handle alone. I played the broken, defeated scapegoat with absolute precision, letting another tear slide down my face. Richard did not look remotely concerned for his crying daughter. He looked incredibly vindicated. He leaned back in his heavy mahogany chair, swirling his expensive champagne with a look of absolute triumph on his weathered face. He told me it was about time. I realized I was not equipped to swim with the big fish in Atlanta. He said financial independence was a dangerous illusion for a black woman who did not have the backing of a powerful institutional husband like Preston. Vivian nodded in total agreement, her emerald earrings catching the morning sunlight. She told me in her sickly, sweet, condescending tone that this was a highly valuable lesson in humility. She said if I had just listened to them from the very beginning and respected the established family hierarchy, none of this corporate nastiness would have happened to me. She casually told me to wipe my face because crying was deeply unbecoming of a woman in our elite social circle. Preston leaned back, linking his hands behind his head. He looked at me like a ruthless conqueror assessing a newly defeated enemy. He told me that since I was finally being reasonable and acting like a proper team player, he would graciously allow me 3 days to pack my belongings before he moved his expanding family into the Buckhead estate. Jasmine could not resist the perfect opportunity to kick me while I was supposedly down. She stood up, smoothing the silk of her white dress over her stomach, where Terrence's secret baby was currently growing. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated malice, thinly disguised as sisterly concern. She called me a weak quitter right in front of our parents. She said it was a tragic shame I could not handle the real pressure of a legacy family, but that some women were simply meant to be followers in life. She rested her manicured hand on her belly and told me that surrendering my $4 million mansion was the absolute least I could do to welcome her new baby into the world. She told me I should consider my complete financial ruin a charitable donation to the glorious future of the family name. She smirked and said, maybe now I would learn how to be properly grateful for the little scraps they threw my way. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, using the sharp physical pain to push another set of tears from my eyes. I nodded submissively, keeping my head bowed so they could not see the cold, mechanical calculation in my gaze. I wiped my wet cheeks with the back of my hand, playing the part of the paranoid, broken woman to absolute perfection. I sniffled loudly and told them I would sign over the deed to the house. I told them I would officially absorb Preston's $12 million hedge fund debt and validate the forged charity documents to save the family from the federal investigators. A collective audible sigh of relief washed over the dining table. Preston actually grinned, showing all his teeth. But then I raised my hand, letting it shake pathetically in the air. I told them I had one strict non-negotiable condition before I handed over my empire. I said the corporate mutiny at my company had made me deeply terrified of backroom deals and shady private lawyers. I insisted that I would not sign a single financial document in secret behind closed doors. I demanded that the signing must happen publicly tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I told them it had to take place at Terrence's elite brokerage firm, with his senior managing partner physically present in the room, to officially notarize the massive property transfer. I framed my demand as a desperate, pathetic plea for ironclad legal protection. I claimed I needed Terrence's highest-ranking boss to witness the transaction, so Terrence could never file another hostile lien against me or try to extort me for more money ever again. I begged them to let me do it strictly by the book, so I could finally have some peace of mind and disappear quietly into the background. Preston and Richard exchanged a deeply knowing look across the table. They thought my demand was absolutely hilarious. They thought my desperate need for official notarization was just the pathetic flailing of a defeated woman trying to cling to some final illusion of safety. Richard chuckled darkly, taking another sip of his champagne, and told me it was a deal. Preston smirked, tapping his fingers on the table, and said he would call Terrence immediately to arrange the main boardroom and ensure the senior managing partner was ready for the morning signing. He told me to bring my favorite pen and warned me not to be late. I thanked them profusely, my voice weak and thoroughly submissive. I grabbed my black leather bag containing the explosive medical file and the deeply incriminating financial records. I walked out of the sunroom, keeping my shoulders slumped and my head down until I passed completely through the heavy front doors of the estate. The moment I stepped onto the sun-baked concrete of the driveway, the fake tears vanished instantly. My posture snapped perfectly straight. I got into my car, locked the heavy doors, and pulled swiftly out of their iron gates. I connected my phone to the dashboard system and dialed my corporate lawyer, Jordan. I told him to prepare the federal SEC violation reports and the immediate foreclosure notices. The Trojan horse was securely inside their gates, and tomorrow morning I was going to burn their entire corporate fortress straight to the ground. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the towering glass facade of the premier wealth management firm in Midtown Atlanta. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, wearing a tailored crimson suit that projected absolute authority and left no room for negotiation. My heels echoed sharply across the imported Italian marble floors of the sprawling lobby, demanding attention from everyone in the vicinity. The receptionist, a young woman with a nervous smile, immediately guided me toward the private executive elevators, realizing instantly that I was not someone to be kept waiting. Ascending to the 50th floor, my reflection in the polished steel doors stared back at me. There was absolutely no trace of the broken, weeping woman who had sat in divorce court a year ago. Today, I was the executioner, and I was about to bring the blade down on their entire fraudulent empire. The heavy frosted glass doors of the main boardroom slid open silently, revealing a space designed to intimidate. The massive room smelled of expensive leather, freshly brewed espresso, and unchecked corporate arrogance. Sitting around the long, polished mahogany table was the unholy trinity of my misery, looking like they had already won the war. Jasmine sat casually crossing her long legs, wearing an outrageously expensive designer sundress, acting as if she had already inherited my entire $4 million estate. Preston was leaning far back in his ergonomic chair, checking his luxury watch and looking every bit the entitled finance executive who firmly believed the world existed solely to serve him. Terrence stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, projecting the false, relaxed confidence of a highly successful broker who thought he held all the winning cards. Seated at the very head of the table was a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a deeply stern expression. He was introduced to me as Richardson, the senior managing partner of the brokerage firm. Richardson gave me a curt, impatient nod, explaining that he was only present to officially notarize the transfer of the Buckhead property deed and to finalize the release of the emergency lien. He spoke with the bored mechanical efficiency of a man who handled multi-million-dollar assets before his morning coffee, and clearly wanted this minor family squabble resolved quickly so he could return to his real work. Terrence smiled, that slick, predatory smile that used to make me sick to my stomach, but now only filled me with deep satisfaction. He slid a thick stack of printed legal documents across the polished wood directly toward my empty chair. He condescendingly told me to take a seat and sign my name on the dotted lines so we could all just move forward with our lives like reasonable adults. Jasmine let out a soft, mocking laugh while playing casually with her diamond tennis bracelet. She told me it was incredibly mature of me to finally stop fighting a losing battle and do what was best for the legacy of our elite family. She said giving up my mansion was a very small price to pay to ensure the continued success of Preston's financial firm. Preston smirked, adjusting the collar of his pastel shirt. He confidently told me the moving trucks were already scheduled for the late afternoon and sternly warned me not to leave the property in a mess on my way out. They genuinely thought they had won the ultimate victory. They sat there basking in their completely delusional triumph, utterly blind to the corporate guillotine swinging rapidly toward their necks. I did not sit down in the chair. I did not even reach for the expensive pen resting neatly beside the property transfer documents. Instead, I looked directly at the senior managing partner, bypassing my family entirely. I told Mr. Ritten that I was not there to sign away my home to appease a bruised male ego. I told him I was actually there to formally report a catastrophic breach of federal securities law occurring inside the very walls of his prestigious firm. The arrogant smiles instantly vanished from the faces of my family members. The air shifted, turning cold and heavy. Terrence lunged forward across the table, trying frantically to snatch the transfer papers back, but I was much faster. I pulled a thick black folder from my leather briefcase and placed it directly into the waiting hands of the senior managing partner. I calmly instructed Mr. Richardson to look at the very first page of the investigative report. I stood perfectly still and watched his seasoned eyes track rapidly across the document. I explained aloud for the entire room to hear that his junior partner Terrence had severely abused his corporate access to file a hostile and entirely fraudulent property lien against a protected blind trust. I pointed out that the blind trust in question was actually a top-tier VIP client account, underwritten and heavily protected by their very own to launch a personal vendetta against an innocent citizen. I told the managing partner that Terrence had attempted to extort me for proprietary corporate software, hoping to use my stolen technology to secure a major promotion within this very firm. I did not stop there because the destruction needed to be absolute. I told the managing partner to turn to the third page, containing the extensive financial forensics my private investigator had meticulously uncovered. I explained how Terrence had actively colluded with Preston, a sinking hedge fund manager, to illegally leverage internal client data to cover up massive institutional debt. The air in the boardroom grew so incredibly thin it felt hard to breathe. I watched the senior partner's face transition from professional annoyance to absolute, unadulterated horror. His hands began to shake visibly as he read the undeniable concrete proof of multiple federal crimes committed under the pristine banner of his reputable firm. Richardson slammed the thick folder onto the mahogany table, the sound echoing through the room like a physical blow. He looked up at Terrence with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute fury. He did not ask for a single explanation. He did not ask for Terrence's side of the story because the forensic digital trail of the SEC violations was entirely airtight and undeniable. Richardson stood up his heavy leather chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He told Terrence that his reckless, selfish actions had just exposed the entire brokerage firm to catastrophic federal liability and devastating public ruin. He firmly informed him that his employment was terminated effective immediately. He added coldly that the firm would be cooperating fully and enthusiastically with the inevitable federal investigation to ensure all criminal liability fell squarely and exclusively on Terrence's shoulders. Terrence completely lost his mind right there in the boardroom. The polished, wealthy facade crumbled instantly into raw, pathetic panic. His chest heaved as he struggled to process how quickly his entire life had just been dismantled. He stammered and choked on his own words, begging the senior partner to just listen to him, pleading that it was all a massive misunderstanding and that he could fix the paperwork right now if they just gave him a second chance. When Richardson completely ignored him and picked up the heavy desk phone to call building security, Terrence spun around frantically and grabbed Preston's arm. He looked at the white hedge fund manager with wild, desperate eyes, demanding that Preston step in and explain the situation to the boss. Terrence screamed that he only filed the illegal lien to get the house to pay off Preston's massive margin calls. He begged Preston to use his old money connections to save his job and keep him out of federal prison, pointing out that they were supposed to be partners in this deal. Preston physically recoiled, ripping his arm out of Terrence's desperate grasp as if he had just been touched by a diseased animal. The arrogant brother-in-law took 3 large, rapid steps back, completely distancing himself from the sinking ship. Preston adjusted his vest, smoothing down the fabric with trembling hands. He looked at Terrence with eyes as cold as ice and flatly denied absolutely everything, preserving his own false innocence. Preston told Terrence he had absolutely no idea what he was talking about and claimed he would never, ever associate his respectable hedge fund with such reckless criminal behavior. Jasmine let out a sharp, horrified gasp, covering her mouth in shock as she watched her husband instantly throw her secret lover to the wolves just to save his own skin. Her eyes darted between the two men, realizing the dangerous game they had all been playing was finally falling apart. Terrence stood there, completely abandoned, jobless, and facing impending federal charges, while the armed security guards marched heavily into the room, grabbing him by the arms to physically drag him out of the building. The heavy glass doors of my private executive suite locked automatically behind me, sealing the room from the rest of the corporate floor. The air inside was completely still, a sharp contrast to the absolute chaos I had just witnessed in the parking lot between my sister and my ex-husband. I walked directly to my desk and pressed the intercom button, instructing my assistant to summon Jordan, my lead corporate attorney, and my chief financial officer. I told her to cancel every single meeting on my calendar for the rest of the afternoon and to block all incoming calls from any numbers associated with my family. There would be absolutely no distractions while I orchestrated the complete financial dismantling of the man who thought he could steal my home. Jordan arrived less than 5 minutes later, carrying a thick stack of manila folders and looking exactly like a man who understood the immense gravity of the situation. My chief financial officer, a brilliant mathematical mind named David, followed closely behind him, clutching his own tablet. They took their seats across from my desk, opening their laptops and waiting in tense silence for my instructions. I did not waste any time with polite pleasantries or casual small talk. I activated the large digital presentation screen mounted on the wall behind me and pulled up the highly encrypted financial files Silas, the private investigator, had retrieved regarding the failing hedge fund. I pointed to the glowing red numbers on the screen, illuminating the absolute financial disaster that Preston was desperately trying to hide from his elite investors and from my wealthy parents. I explained to Jordan and David that my arrogant brother-in-law had heavily over-leveraged his positions in commercial real estate and highly volatile tech stocks. He had gambled recklessly with old money funds and lost spectacularly. The screen clearly showed that his firm was currently facing exactly $12 million in aggressive margin calls from 3 different major institutional banks. Those massive banks were entirely tired of his empty excuses and were actively preparing to seize his personal assets by the end of the week if he did not provide immediate liquid cash. I turned to David and told him I wanted to initiate an immediate and highly aggressive leveraged buyout of that specific distressed debt. I instructed him to contact the institutional banks holding Preston's margin loans right this second. I told him we were going to purchase that exact portfolio of toxic debt, and we were going to do it today before the financial markets closed. I wanted my real estate tech company to become the sole owner of every single dollar that Preston owed in this world. I wanted to buy the actual paper that controlled his entire financial existence, and I was willing to pay a heavy premium to bypass the standard banking waiting periods just to ensure the transaction cleared immediately. David stared at the glowing screen, his face rapidly draining of color as he quickly calculated the massive risk involved in my direct command. He looked at me as if I had completely lost my mind. He pointed out that buying toxic distressed debt from a failing hedge fund was the exact opposite of a sound corporate financial strategy. He carefully explained that Preston's fund was effectively a sinking ship and that absorbing his $12 million liability would heavily expose our own company to massive unnecessary risk. David passionately argued that we had just secured the $80 million Tokyo contract and that we should be focusing all our energy on stable corporate growth rather than throwing our hard-earned capital into a chaotic financial black hole. I leaned across my glass desk, resting my hands flat against the cool, smooth surface. I told David that I did not care about the standard models of stable corporate growth right now. I explained that this specific transaction was not about generating a positive quarterly return on investment for our shareholders. This was a targeted, hostile takeover of a human being. Preston had spent the entire morning standing on my front porch threatening to throw me out of my own home and actively orchestrating a corporate coup to steal my company, just to save his own skin. He genuinely thought his proximity to white institutional wealth made him completely untouchable in Atlanta. He needed to learn a very hard lesson about who actually held the real power in this city. I instructed my team to use a portion of the newly deposited funds from the Tokyo contract as the liquid leverage required to execute the debt purchase. I told them to set up a discreet blind shell corporation to handle the transaction so the institutional banks would not immediately recognize exactly who was buying the paper. The banks were undeniably desperate to offload Preston's toxic portfolio before his hedge fund officially went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. If we swooped in right now and offered to take the $12 million burden completely off their hands, they would push the paperwork through compliance without asking too many difficult questions. Jordan, my lawyer, had been sitting quietly analyzing the complex legal implications of the maneuver. He finally spoke up, his voice heavy with extreme caution. He warned me that this level of aggressive financial maneuvering was incredibly dangerous. He explained that if we absorbed Preston's debt, we would effectively become his sole legal creditor. We would have the absolute legal right to demand immediate repayment, to seize his personal bank accounts, to liquidate his luxury vehicles, and to force his hedge fund into immediate receivership. But Jordan also highlighted the catastrophic downside of this revenge tactic. Jordan pulled up a risk assessment document on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if Preston had already hidden his remaining assets in offshore accounts, or if his firm collapsed completely, before we could legally collect, we would be left holding an empty bag. He explicitly warned me that absorbing $12 million of dead weight could critically destabilize our own operating budget going into the next quarter. He said that if the Tokyo conglomerate caught wind of this reckless personal expenditure, they might get spooked and pull their future licensing agreements. Jordan stated plainly that if this vendetta failed, it could literally bankrupt my entire company and destroy everything I had built over the last 4 years of my life. I listened to his dire warnings, absorbing every single word into my mind. I understood the catastrophic risks perfectly. But the sickening image of Preston smirking in my parents' dining room, bragging about his superior genetics and threatening to release a blackmail tape to ruin my life, was burned deeply into my mind. They had tried to destroy me using the legal system during my divorce, and now they were trying to destroy me using my own family charity foundation. I was completely done playing defense against these monsters. I told Jordan to draft the acquisition papers immediately. I told him to wire the funds to the institutional banks and secure the debt portfolio before the clock struck 5. David and Jordan worked frantically for the next 3 hours. The peaceful executive suite transformed into a chaotic war room of rapid phone calls, frantic emails, and aggressive digital negotiations. I paced the length of my large office, watching the afternoon sun begin to dip lower in the Atlanta sky, casting long shadows across the floor. The institutional banks were hesitant, at first confused as to why a random holding company wanted to purchase such a highly toxic portfolio. But the promise of immediate liquid cash was simply too tempting for their risk management departments to refuse. At exactly 4:15 in the afternoon, the heavy commercial printer in the corner of my office whirred to life. The final binding legal contracts began to spill out onto the tray, one page at a time. Jordan gathered the thick stack of warm papers and aligned them neatly on my desk. The documents officially transferred the entirety of Preston's margin calls, his business loans, and his personal financial obligations directly to my holding company. The paperwork granted me absolute unchecked authority over his entire economic survival. Jordan handed me a heavy metal pen. He looked at me one last time, his expression a mixture of deep professional concern and profound respect. He told me again that signing these documents meant crossing the absolute point of no return. He reiterated his final warning that absorbing this massive debt could bankrupt me completely if Preston could not pay. He said I was risking my entire corporate empire on a brutal family vendetta. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I took the pen from his hand and pressed the tip firmly against the signature line on the final page. I looked up at my lawyer, my voice dripping with cold, absolute certainty. I told him I was well aware of the financial risks, but the price was entirely worth it. I signed my name in thick, bold strokes, officially executing the most aggressive financial trap of my entire career. I dropped the pen onto the glass desk and smiled warmly at the men in the room. "I am not just buying debt," I said softly. "I am buying the leash to my brother-in-law's neck." The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was completely transformed into a sickening display of excessive wealth and fabricated perfection. It was the absolute pinnacle of the autumn social season, marking the highly anticipated 40th wedding anniversary of my parents, Richard and Vivian. They had rented out the entire top floor of the luxury Atlanta hotel, draping every conceivable surface in imported white orchids and cascading gold silk. A 12-piece orchestra played soft classical music in the corner, while waiters in immaculate white coats circulated endlessly with silver trays of black caviar and vintage champagne. This was not a genuine celebration of love or marital endurance. This was a highly calculated public relations event designed to solidify their status at the absolute top of the African-American elite hierarchy. I stood near the back of the room, cloaked in the heavy shadows near the velvet curtains, watching the ridiculous masquerade unfold. I wore a simple tailored black evening gown, deliberately contrasting with the endless sea of glittering sequins and flashy diamonds surrounding me. The air in the room was thick with the smell of expensive designer perfumes and unchecked arrogance. The guest list was a literal who is who of Atlanta power brokers and high society gatekeepers. I recognized 3 local judges, the district attorney, and several prominent city council members, mingling near the open bar, laughing too loudly at things that were not funny. Wealthy real estate developers and hospital board members threw their heads back in practiced displays of camaraderie, holding their expensive drinks like weapons of status. My parents moved through the glittering crowd like absolute royalty, accepting lavish gifts and fawning compliments with deeply practiced grace. Vivian wore a custom silver gown that caught the chandelier light with every single step, her neck heavy with diamonds that cost more than most people's homes. Richard was dressed in a bespoke tailored tuxedo, shaking hands and slapping backs, projecting the flawless image of an untouchable patriarch. They were completely in their element, surrounded by the very people they had sacrificed my mental health and my financial security to impress. They traded empty pleasantries and networking tips, feeding off the validation of a crowd that only cared about their bank accounts. Near the absolute center of the ballroom, Preston and Jasmine held court at a prime VIP table. Preston was desperately acting the part of the perfect wealthy son-in-law, laughing heartily with a group of older conservative white investors. He was drinking heavily, downing his scotch with a nervous, rapid energy that betrayed the absolute panic boiling just beneath his skin. His forehead was visibly shining with cold sweat under the warm ambient lights. He did not yet know that I was the anonymous holding company who had purchased his catastrophic $12 million debt portfolio just hours earlier, but he certainly knew his hedge fund was on the absolute brink of total annihilation. Yet there he stood playing the confident finance savior of the family, while his financial world burned to the ground, actively trying to solicit more investments from the elderly men standing around him. Jasmine clung to his arm, showcasing her newly announced pregnancy to a group of fawning society wives. She wore a form-fitting blush gown, keeping her hand resting constantly on her stomach. She played the role of the devoted mother, perfectly, utterly blind to the fact that her pristine suburban life and her fraudulent marriage were about to be violently ripped away in front of everyone she respected. The orchestra suddenly quieted down, and the gentle clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal glass echoed sharply through the massive ballroom. Richard stood at the main podium on the elevated stage, gripping the wooden edges with a look of supreme, arrogant satisfaction. The main spotlight illuminated his face as the hundreds of influential guests turned their full attention to the front of the room. The chatter died down instantly, replaced by a respectful hush. My father began a long-winded, grandiose speech about the vital importance of family legacy and the heavy burdens of community leadership. He spoke passionately about building his empire from absolutely nothing and the profound joy of seeing his vision carried forward by the next generation. He talked about the charity foundation they had built, claiming it was their ultimate gift to the underprivileged youth of Atlanta. He did not mention my name a single time during his extensive monologue. He completely erased my existence from his public narrative, treating me as a shameful secret that had been successfully swept under the rug. Instead, he gestured broadly toward the front table, where Preston and Jasmine sat beaming with pride. Richard raised his crystal glass high in the air and told the entire room of politicians and elite investors that his eldest daughter and her brilliant husband were the absolute gold standard of our family. He praised Preston's remarkable financial acumen and called him the sturdy anchor that kept our family firmly grounded in prosperity and unwavering honor. He told the crowd that Preston's integration into the family had elevated their business ventures to unprecedented new heights, and that he could not be prouder of the man his daughter had chosen to marry. The sheer hypocrisy of praising a man who had actively embezzled from their own youth charity fund was physically nauseating to witness. The entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause, honoring a man who was drowning in toxic debt and a woman who had committed blatant perjury in a federal courtroom. They cheered for a fabricated illusion of black excellence, while the real foundation of their family rotted away from the inside out. I did not wait for the clapping to die down. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. My heels clicked sharply and rhythmically against the polished marble floor, cutting right through the fading applause. Heads turned immediately, and frantic whispers rapidly spread through the glittering crowd as I approached the stage. Richard froze mid-sip, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock as he registered my presence in the room. Vivian let out a small, audible gasp from her seat at the front table, her hand flying to her chest. I walked directly up the carpeted stairs, uninvited and completely unapologetic. I did not break eye contact with my father as I closed the distance between us. I stepped right up to the wooden podium and firmly ripped the heavy microphone straight out of his trembling hands before he could utter a single word of protest. I did not look at him or offer any kind of greeting. I looked straight to the back of the enormous room and gave a sharp, subtle nod to the audio-visual technician sitting diligently at the control board. He was a highly trusted independent contractor I had personally hired and heavily compensated the day before. I watched with cold, absolute satisfaction as he instantly killed the warm, ambient lighting in the ballroom, plunging the audience into a dramatic dimness. Without a second's hesitation, he hardwired my encrypted tablet directly into the massive ceiling-height projector screens hanging ominously behind the stage, waiting to broadcast their ultimate destruction. The massive screens behind me flickered to life, casting a harsh, blinding white glare across the horrified faces of the Atlanta elite. I gripped the microphone tightly, feeling the cool metal ground me as a collective gasp rippled through the Waldorf Astoria ballroom. The first image projected above my head was not a loving family portrait or a touching montage of my parents' 40 years of marriage. It was a highly classified federal banking document, blown up to 30 feet tall, highlighting a $12 million wire transfer from the Youth Legacy Foundation directly into Preston's failing hedge fund. I looked out at the sea of wealthy politicians and prominent socialites, watching their champagne glasses freeze in midair as their brains struggled to process the enormous financial crime displayed right in front of their eyes. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers with absolute unwavering authority. My father just gave a beautiful, touching speech about family legacy and community leadership. He spoke so passionately about the charity foundation you all so generously donate your hard-earned money to, year after year. But Richard and Vivian forgot to mention exactly how your charitable donations are actually being utilized behind closed doors. I tapped the presentation clicker in my hand, and the giant screen behind me shifted to a split view showing Preston's catastrophic margin calls, right next to the forged guarantor signatures, bearing my exact name. I paced slowly across the elevated stage, looking directly at the tables of wealthy donors who had blindly trusted my parents for decades. I told the silent, captivated room that while my father was standing up here accepting prestigious awards for his philanthropy, he was secretly draining the accounts meant to build community centers for underprivileged Black youth in our city. I raised my voice, making sure every single syllable pierced the quiet room, hitting the ears of the judges and politicians who had backed my father's ventures. My parents stole from a foundation meant to uplift Black children, just to save the fragile ego of a mediocre white hedge fund manager who was drowning in his own incompetent financial bets. They committed federal wire fraud and embezzled your money, all while looking me dead in the eye and telling me I was the ultimate family disappointment for daring to build my own independent technology company without their explicit permission. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The wealthy conservative investors sitting at Preston's exclusive VIP table immediately stood up, knocking their expensive mahogany chairs backward onto the marble floor. They stared at the projected bank statements verifying the absolute insolvency of the hedge fund they had poured their generational wealth into. Preston looked like he was having a massive coronary event right there in his tailored tuxedo. He was clutching his chest, his face flushed a dangerous mottled purple as he realized his entire facade of old money superiority was being publicly butchered. Vivian was hyperventilating, clinging to the edge of the front table, trying desperately to hide her face from the flashing camera phones that were suddenly emerging from the crowd. Richard stood frozen beside the stage, his mouth opening and closing silently, entirely stripped of his patriarchal power and influence. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the heavily encrypted shell company transactions that proved my parents had actively facilitated the money laundering scheme for months. I explained to the crowd of city council members and local developers exactly how Preston used his proximity to our prominent Black family to legitimize his failing business, while secretly despising the very people who were keeping him afloat. I told them that my parents were so deeply intoxicated by their desperate need for white institutional validation that they willingly sacrificed their own daughter, their own community, and their own moral compass, just to keep this pathetic man sitting at the head of their dinner table. The whispers in the ballroom escalated into angry shouts as the reality of the embezzlement washed over the prominent guests. People were actively pulling out their phones to call their personal attorneys and financial advisors right there on the ballroom floor. Jasmine was sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands, as the other society wives physically backed away from her table, treating her like an absolute pariah. She tried to reach out to the women who had just been fawning over her pregnancy, but they turned their backs, completely disgusted by the massive fraud unfolding on the screens. Preston could not take the humiliation anymore. The crushing weight of his public annihilation snapped whatever fragile tether he had left to reality. He let out a guttural, animalistic scream that tore through the ballroom, echoing with pure, humiliated rage. He shoved a waiter violently out of his path, sending a silver tray of crystal champagne flutes shattering sharply across the floor. He charged blindly toward the stage, his hands balled into tight fists, intent on physically ripping me away from the podium and destroying the equipment broadcasting his federal crimes to the world. Richard tried to reach out and grab his arm to stop him, but Preston shoved his beloved father-in-law so hard, the older man stumbled backward and crashed into a massive floral arrangement. I did not flinch or step back. I stood my ground watching the sweaty, enraged finance executive sprint toward the carpeted stairs of the stage. But Preston never even made it to the first step. Bursting through the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the ballroom was a figure nobody expected to see. It was Terrence. My slick ex-husband looked absolutely deranged, his designer suit torn and heavily stained with spilled liquor. He had clearly bypassed hotel security fueled by cheap alcohol and the desperate panic of a man who had just lost his entire career to federal investigators because of my visit to his brokerage firm that morning. Terrence let out a deafening roar and sprinted across the ballroom, intercepting Preston just inches from the stage. Terrence launched his entire body weight forward, hitting Preston with a brutal tackling force that sent both men crashing violently into the front row tables. The loud crunch of splintering wood and shattering fine china filled the air as elite guests screamed and scrambled out of the way, holding their evening gowns to avoid the flying glass. Terrence pinned Preston hard against the polished marble floor, wrapping his hands aggressively into the collar of Preston's expensive shirt. Terrence shook him violently, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding Preston give him the money they stole during the divorce so he could flee the city before the FBI issued his arrest warrant. The perfectly curated high society anniversary gala had officially devolved into an absolute bloodbath. Terrence threw another wild, desperate punch that connected solidly with the side of Preston's jaw. The sickening sound of bone hitting bone echoed over the horrified gasps of the society wives who were frantically scrambling to pull their imported silk gowns away from the bloody scuffle. Richard lunged forward with his arms outstretched, trying desperately to grab Terrence's collar, but the disgraced broker violently shoved the older man aside with a burst of drunken adrenaline. Terrence was screaming breathless obscenities, demanding his stolen money, and roaring that his entire corporate life was over, and he was absolutely not going down alone. The polished white savior of the family was currently bleeding profusely onto the imported marble floor. His pastel tie ripped and ruined, his perfectly gelled hair plastered to his sweating forehead. Jasmine finally broke free from her frozen state of shock. She sprinted across the shattered crystal and broken porcelain, completely ignoring the safety of the unborn child she had been parading around the ballroom all night. She grabbed Terrence by the shoulders, pulling him off her bleeding husband with a sudden burst of frantic energy. She stood squarely between the two men, her chest heaving, her perfect hair falling in messy strands around her flushed face. She spun around and glared up at me, standing on the stage with absolute murderous rage burning in her eyes. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face and screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a deeply sick monster. She yelled that I was deliberately destroying our perfect family because I simply could not stand seeing her happy and successful. She loudly claimed to the entire room that I was a bitter, lonely woman who wanted to tear down everything my generous parents had built just to satisfy my own pathetic, petty jealousy. She demanded that I turn off the projector screens immediately before I ruined the prestigious family legacy forever. I did not blink. I did not flinch at her screaming. I simply looked down at my older sister and let a cold, mechanical smile touch my lips. I pressed the heavy plastic button on the presentation clicker in my right hand. The enormous projection screens behind me went entirely black for a fraction of a second, plunging the stage into darkness. Then a grainy high-definition security video began to play on a continuous silent loop. It was highly classified footage captured directly from the 12th floor hallway of a luxury downtown Atlanta hotel. The digital timestamp glowing brightly in the bottom right corner displayed a date from exactly 4 years ago, a time when I was supposedly happily married to the very man currently panting and bleeding on the ballroom floor. The video clearly showed Jasmine wearing a distinct red designer dress, looking around the empty hallway nervously before walking quickly down the corridor. Seconds later, Terrence stepped aggressively into the frame. He grabbed my sister by the waist and kissed her passionately right there in the brightly lit hallway before sliding a magnetic keycard into the door of room 402. The two of them disappeared inside the hotel room together, closing the heavy wooden door behind them. The video looped seamlessly and played the sickening betrayal again and again for the entire room to witness. A collective horrified gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. The influential politicians and wealthy venture capitalists stared at the massive screens in absolute stunned disbelief. The pristine, flawless image of the golden child was completely incinerated in real time under the glowing light of the projectors. Vivian let out a strangled, agonizing cry and covered her face with both of her trembling hands, unable to witness her precious daughter's profound moral failure being broadcast to every single prominent socialite in the city. Richard stood totally paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically between the enormous projector screens and the disgraced daughter who had just humiliated him beyond any hope of repair. The room grew so incredibly quiet, you could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of the two men fighting on the floor. Terrence slowly pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, staring blankly at the 50-foot-tall projection of his own disgusting betrayal. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumping as he realized his secret leverage over the family was now public knowledge. Preston was still lying flat on his back, clutching his bleeding jaw. He blinked hard, trying to clear the blood and sweat from his vision as he looked up at the looping video. The white hedge fund manager looked at his beautiful, perfect wife, and then looked at the man who had just brutally assaulted him. The horrible reality of their illicit relationship was slowly sinking into his arrogant, heavily intoxicated brain. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the very edge of the carpeted stage, looking directly down at Preston. I kept my voice remarkably calm and steady, allowing the microphone to carry my cold words to every single corner of the silent ballroom. I told Preston that he really needed to pay much closer attention to the people sleeping in his own massive estate. I looked at the dark red blood dripping from his chin onto his crisp white shirt. "By the way, Preston," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the massive speaker system. "Congratulations on baby number 4. It is an absolute medical miracle considering your documented and irreversible vasectomy from exactly 3 years ago." The entire room erupted into an absolute frenzy of shocked, frantic whispers. The mayor of Atlanta physically turned away in disgust, while several prominent charity board members began rapidly texting on their phones. Preston froze completely, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as he stared up at me. He snapped his head toward Jasmine, who was standing completely motionless, her face drained of all color. She looked like she had just seen a ghost hovering in the middle of the room. She slowly backed away from both men, shaking her head back and forth side to side, as if trying to physically deny the reality of the catastrophic situation. I did not give them a single second to recover or fabricate another elaborate lie. I pressed the clicker one final time. The hotel security footage vanished from the massive screens. In its place, 2 distinct documents appeared side by side, spanning the entire width of the stage. On the left side of the screen was a scanned copy of Preston's official surgical confirmation retrieved directly from his highly exclusive private medical clinic in Midtown. The document clearly detailed his elective bilateral vasectomy and featured his unmistakable signature at the very bottom. On the right side of the screen was a series of blown-up text messages sent directly from Terrence's personal cell phone to Jasmine's private number. The texts explicitly demanded that Jasmine liquidate her hidden assets to pay off Terrence's mounting legal fees, threatening to tell Preston the absolute truth about who actually fathered the child currently growing in her stomach. The sheer weight of the indisputable evidence crashed down on the ballroom like a solid concrete vault. Preston let out a suffocating, agonizing groan, realizing his entire marriage, his beloved children, and his so-called superior genetics were nothing but a sickening, fabricated lie. He looked at the medical records and the extortion texts and completely broke down, sobbing hysterically into his bloody hands on the cold marble floor. Jasmine collapsed heavily to her knees, right in the middle of the shattered crystal glass. She grabbed the sides of her head, pulling at her perfect hair, and let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed terribly over the quiet jazz music still playing softly in the background. Jasmine's piercing scream continued to echo through the grand ballroom, tearing through the suffocating silence. The sound was entirely primal, full of absolute devastation and public ruin. I stood on the edge of the stage looking down at the scattered remains of my family. The wealthy politicians and prominent real estate developers who had spent the last 2 hours drinking my parents' expensive champagne were no longer just watching. Every single one of them had pulled out their smartphones. The glowing rectangular screens formed a digital wall around the dance floor, actively recording every single second of the brutal fallout. The black elite of Atlanta, the very people my parents had sacrificed my sanity to impress, were capturing the destruction of the family legacy in high-definition video. I watched a prominent city councilman lean over and whisper frantically to his wife before they both turned their backs on my father and began walking swiftly toward the exit. Richard saw the councilman leaving, and absolute terror finally broke through his paralysis. He stumbled forward, his bespoke tuxedo jacket hanging loosely on his shoulders. He reached out, trying to grab the arm of the lead investor from the charity board, begging him to just wait and let him explain the misunderstanding. The investor yanked his arm away with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The older man told my father that he was a complete disgrace and that their business relationship was permanently terminated. Other guests followed suit, creating a massive wave of people rushing toward the heavy oak doors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of federal fraud and incestuous infidelity. They pushed past each other, dropping their expensive gift bags on the floor, eager to escape the room before their own reputations could be tarnished by association. The reality of his total social and financial annihilation crashed down on Richard all at once. The powerful patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist suddenly grabbed the left side of his chest. His knees buckled violently, and he collapsed against the edge of a shattered banquet table. He was gasping for air, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. Sweat poured down his ashen face as he experienced a massive, severe panic attack right in the middle of the ruined ballroom. He clutched his pristine shirt, tearing at the expensive fabric, desperately trying to pull oxygen into his restricting lungs. For my entire life, he had told me I was too weak to handle the pressure of the corporate world. Now he was literally suffocating under the weight of his own dismantled ego. He fell to his knees, his chest heaving irregularly, as the very people he worshipped walked out and left him completely behind. Vivian watched her husband collapse to the floor, and her perfectly curated reality finally snapped. The cold, calculating matriarch completely lost her mind. She looked at the fleeing guests. She looked at her golden child sobbing in a pile of broken glass, and then she looked up at me standing untouched on the stage. Pure, blinding hatred twisted her features into something unrecognizable. She let out a furious scream, dropping her expensive designer clutch onto the floor. She marched aggressively toward the stage, her silver gown dragging heavily behind her, sweeping through the spilled champagne and ruined floral arrangements. She marched up the short flight of carpeted stairs, entirely fueled by humiliated rage. She did not say a single word to me. She simply reared back her right hand, her heavy diamond rings catching the glare of the projector screens, preparing to strike me across the face with all the furious strength she possessed. She wanted to physically punish me for daring to expose the rotting foundation of her perfect life. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I raised my left hand and caught her wrist mid-swing right in the air. My grip closed around her forearm like a steel vise, completely stopping her momentum in an instant. Vivian gasped in shock, her eyes widening as she struggled frantically against my hold. She pulled and twisted, but I refused to let go, keeping her arm suspended between us. I looked down into the terrified eyes of the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small and hopelessly inadequate. I leaned in close so only she could hear the absolute cold certainty in my voice. I told her she would never lay another hand on me for the rest of her miserable life. I told her she built her entire identity on a foundation of lies and stolen money, and now she was going to have to live in the ashes of the empire she helped burn to the ground. I looked at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone and casually reminded her that the jewelry was likely purchased with the exact same charity funds she helped Preston steal. I told her she was nothing but a common thief hiding behind a country club membership and that her precious society friends would never answer her phone calls ever again. I released my grip and violently threw her arm backward. The force of the rejection sent my mother stumbling awkwardly down the carpeted stairs. She lost her footing entirely and fell hard onto the polished marble floor, landing just a few feet away from where my father was still clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. Vivian sat on the ground, her perfect silver gown bunched up around her knees, her elaborate hairstyle completely ruined, looking up at me with absolute defeated terror. She reached out a trembling hand toward Richard, but he was too consumed by his own panic to even notice her. The grand ballroom was nearly empty of guests now. The 12-piece orchestra had packed their instruments and fled out the back service doors minutes ago, leaving only the sound of my family completely falling apart. The only people left in the massive opulent space were the shattered remains of my biological family. Terrence was sitting on the floor nursing his bruised and bloody face, realizing he had completely failed to extort his way out of federal charges and was now going to face the wrath of the justice system totally alone. Preston was curled into a pathetic ball near the broken champagne glasses, utterly destroyed by the public revelation of his sterile medical history and his wife's disgusting betrayal. Jasmine was rocking back and forth crying out for someone to help her, but nobody moved to offer her any comfort. They were all completely trapped in the massive wreckage of their own making, drowning in the consequences they had created for themselves. I stood on the stage looking out over the absolute devastation. I felt no guilt and no remorse. I had not created this disaster. I had simply turned on the lights so everyone could see the monsters hiding in the dark. I reached down and unplugged my encrypted tablet from the audio-visual system, watching the massive 50-foot projection screens go completely black. The sudden darkness in the front of the room made the large floor-to-ceiling windows at the back of the ballroom much more prominent. The deep shadows of the room settled over the ruined tables and the sobbing figures on the floor. I looked past the broken tables and the crying figures on the floor, staring directly out the heavy glass windows overlooking the busy Atlanta streets below. The dark night sky was suddenly illuminated by a rapid rhythmic flashing pattern. Intense beams of bright blue and harsh red light swept aggressively across the ballroom walls, reflecting off the scattered crystals and the imported marble floor. The wailing sound of heavy sirens grew deafeningly loud, echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers and vibrating through the thick glass of the hotel windows. The strobing lights illuminated the tears streaming down my sister's face, and the absolute terror in my father's wide eyes. I looked down at my broken family and smiled coldly, knowing exactly what was waiting for them in the lobby. The police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived. The heavy double doors of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom violently burst open, hitting the wood-paneled walls with a deafening crash. Dozens of armed men and women wearing dark tactical jackets with bold yellow FBI and IRS letters printed across their backs flooded into the devastated event space. Local Atlanta police officers flanked them, moving with rapid military precision to secure every single exit and blocking any remaining society guests from leaving the active crime scene. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing woman with a stern, unyielding face, held up a gold badge and loudly ordered everyone in the room to freeze exactly where they stood. The remaining politicians and wealthy developers pressed their backs flat against the floral-decorated walls, absolutely terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. The chaotic sounds of Terrence and Preston fighting on the floor abruptly stopped. The two bruised and bloody men froze in place, staring up at the swarm of federal investigators rapidly surrounding their shattered VIP table. The lead agent marched directly down the center aisle, her heavy black boots crunching loudly over the broken crystal champagne glasses and smashed porcelain plates. She did not look at my father clutching his chest on the floor or my mother weeping pathetically in the corner. She walked straight toward the stage, looking up at me standing perfectly still behind the wooden podium. She asked me to confirm my identity and verify that I was the informant who submitted the encrypted digital portfolio. I walked down the carpeted stairs and met her halfway across the ruined dance floor, maintaining my posture and keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady, letting the echoing acoustics of the massive room carry my words to my terrified family. I told the agent that I had personally transmitted the entire forensic dossier containing the forged charity guarantor signatures. the illegal blind trust liens, and the massive hedge fund embezzlement logs directly to the white-collar crime division exactly 48 hours ago. Preston let out a pathetic high-pitched whimpering sound, realizing his complete corporate annihilation was no longer just a private family matter, but a highly coordinated federal takedown. He scrambled backward across the slippery marble floor, trying desperately to put physical distance between himself and the advancing federal agents. He frantically wiped the dark red blood from his mouth and started aggressively pointing his shaking finger at Terrence. The arrogant hedge fund manager instantly attempted to throw his secret accomplice under the bus, screaming that Terrence was the one who filed the illegal property documents and that he had absolutely no idea the charity funds were misappropriated. Terrence barked a harsh, bloody laugh and immediately fired back. He yelled to the federal agents that Preston was the true mastermind who orchestrated the entire $12 million money laundering scheme to save his failing investment portfolio. The two men who had just been beating each other to a pulp were now openly confessing to multiple federal crimes right in front of the investigating officers, desperately trying to save their own skin. The lead agent did not entertain their pathetic finger-pointing or their cowardly attempts to pass the blame. She gave a sharp physical signal to her tactical team, waving her hand toward the two men cowering on the floor. 4 heavily armed agents swooped in and violently yanked both men off the ground, pinning their arms securely behind their backs. The cold, sharp click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, locking tightly around the wrists of the former golden child and the disgraced wealth manager. The agent loudly read them, their Miranda rights detailing the severe federal charges of wire fraud, corporate extortion, and money laundering. She informed them that their personal bank accounts were already frozen and that their corporate offices were currently being raided by separate federal teams across the city. The remaining members of Atlanta high society watched in absolute horrified fascination as the two men were aggressively marched toward the exit in absolute disgrace. My father. Richard watched the scene unfold from his position on the floor, his breathing still ragged and shallow. He reached out a trembling hand toward the agents, trying to use his booming patriarch voice to demand they unhand his prestigious son-in-law. He croaked out that this was all a massive misunderstanding and that he was a highly respected community leader who could make a few phone calls to clear this up. One of the local police officers simply looked down at him with a mixture of pity and severe warning, telling him to stay on the ground and remain silent unless he wanted to be detained for obstructing a federal investigation. Vivian let out another agonizing wail, seeing the pristine reputation she had spent 40 years building completely evaporate in a matter of seconds. Their elite social standing, their country club memberships, and their carefully curated black excellence facade were entirely gone, replaced by the devastating reality of a highly publicized white-collar criminal arrest. Jasmine watched her entire fabricated reality being dragged away in chains. She crawled across the floor, her expensive blush silk dress completely ruined by spilled wine and dark blood, dragging herself directly to my feet. She grabbed my ankles, her perfectly manicured hands shaking uncontrollably as she looked up at me with raw, pathetic desperation. The golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself was now groveling on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. She begged me to call my corporate lawyers and retract the federal evidence immediately. She sobbed hysterically, claiming that I had already proven my point and successfully ruined the anniversary gala, so there was no need to take things this far. She tightened her grip on my ankles, her tears soaking into the fabric of my dress. She cried that I needed to drop the federal charges right this second because she could not bear the thought of her precious children growing up and suddenly losing their father to the federal prison system. She pleaded that family was supposed to protect each other, and that I owed it to my nieces and nephews to keep their family unit intact. I looked down at my weeping older sister, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman who had happily tried to destroy my life and steal my company. I did not reach down to comfort her or help her up from the broken glass. I tilted my head slightly and let a cold, merciless smile touch my face, looking directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I asked her a simple, devastating question. Which father, Jasmine, the broke one or the one in handcuffs? 2 weeks had passed since the night the federal agents dragged my ex-husband and my arrogant brother-in-law out of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom in heavy steel chains. The spectacular implosion of my parents' 40th anniversary gala had become the absolute biggest scandal in the history of Atlanta high society. The local news networks and prestigious financial blogs ran endless daily segments detailing the massive charity embezzlement scheme and the complete collapse of the fraudulent hedge fund. My name was entirely cleared from the wreckage. My corporate lawyers successfully presented undeniable proof that I was the anonymous whistleblower who handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation the entire forensic portfolio. My real estate technology firm was thriving, having successfully secured the $80 million Tokyo contract without a single local investor trying to sabotage my leadership ever again. The air inside my $4 million Buckhead mansion was incredibly still and perfectly quiet, a beautiful contrast to the absolute chaos completely consuming the rest of my biological family. I sat behind the massive glass desk in my private home office, watching the morning sunlight filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Spread out neatly across my desk were the final notarized legal documents executing the immediate foreclosure on my parents' sprawling Alpharetta estate. The banks had wasted absolutely no time freezing their assets the second the charity fraud became public knowledge. The federal authorities meticulously traced the laundered funds directly back to my father's accounts, proving he actively collateralized his own home to secure Preston's desperate loans. Richard and Vivian were now complete social pariahs, actively shunned by the exact same elite community they had sacrificed my mental health to impress. Their prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked, and their former wealthy friends refused to even acknowledge their existence on the street. They were currently facing astronomical federal fines and a very real possibility of serving extensive jail time for wire fraud and conspiracy. Their desperate attempts to secure a high-profile defense attorney failed completely because no reputable law firm in the city wanted to touch such a highly publicized toxic case. They were forced to pack their remaining personal belongings and vacate their luxurious mansion in absolute disgrace, moving into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city while awaiting their federal indictment. The devastation of my sister was even more profound and thoroughly satisfying to witness from a comfortable distance. Jasmine had spent her entire life floating on a cloud of unearned privilege, believing her status as the golden child made her completely untouchable. But the absolute brutal reality of her actions finally caught up to her in the most spectacular way possible. The public revelation of her sordid 4-year affair with Terrence completely shattered her flawless socialite image beyond any hope of repair. Preston immediately filed for a hostile divorce the very next morning from his holding cell, completely abandoning her and cutting off her access to whatever meager funds he managed to hide from federal investigators. He was facing decades in federal prison, and he made sure to legally separate himself from the woman who publicly humiliated him with another man's child. Terrence was equally ruthless in his absolute desperation to save his own skin. Facing a massive list of federal securities violations and corporate extortion charges, my slick ex-husband panicked and immediately liquidated every single hidden asset he and Jasmine secretly accumulated during their affair. He aggressively drained the offshore accounts they funded using the money he stole from my startup company during our divorce. He used every last stolen cent to pay retainer fees for a team of ruthless criminal defense lawyers, leaving Jasmine with absolutely nothing. The golden child who had worn custom silk gowns and mocked me for building my own wealth was now entirely broke with 3 children and a 4th on the way. She had been unceremoniously evicted from her upscale suburban home when the bank seized Preston's assets, and she was now forced to live in a cheap, rundown motel off a noisy interstate highway. The women she used to host lavish brunches with actively ignored her desperate phone calls, treating her like a contagious disease they needed to avoid at all costs. I signed my name at the bottom of the final foreclosure document, officially taking ownership of the properties my parents lost. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or regret. I simply allowed the natural consequences of their own malicious greed to unfold exactly as they were always meant to. I closed the thick leather folder and pushed it to the side of my desk, taking a slow, deep breath of the perfectly quiet air in my home. The silence was beautifully interrupted by the soft, pleasant chime of my secure home intercom system echoing from the panel mounted on the wall near my office door. I stood up from my ergonomic chair and walked slowly across the plush carpet toward the security monitor. The high-definition camera mounted at the heavy iron gates of my estate displayed a crisp, clear feed of the perimeter. Standing outside my property looking like a completely broken shell of a human being was my older sister. Jasmine was standing in the brutal Atlanta heat, holding a cheap plastic grocery bag containing whatever meager possessions she had left. She was not wearing imported designer clothing or flawless makeup. She looked utterly exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her face pale and heavily stained with running mascara. She was pressing the intercom button repeatedly, her hands shaking visibly as she stared up at the security camera lens. I tapped the screen to unmute the exterior audio feed, but I kept my own microphone completely silenced. I stood there in my beautiful, quiet home and listened to the sound of my sister weeping through the small speaker. She was sobbing hysterically, begging me to please open the massive iron gates and let her inside. She cried out that she had nowhere else to go and that the cheap motel was unsafe for her children. She pleaded with me to remember that we were family and begged me to let her live in the small guest house at the back of my property. She promised she would clean the floors and do the landscaping if I just gave her a safe place to sleep, claiming she was entirely desperate and truly sorry for everything she had done to me. The woman who confidently told me I was a weak quitter, who deserved to lose my entire corporate empire, was now crying on the hot pavement, begging for the absolute bare minimum scraps of my success. She pleaded for a single ounce of the mercy she actively denied me when she stood in a courtroom and lied under oath to ruin my life. She sobbed into the intercom, promising she would do anything to make it right if I just pressed the button and let her cross the threshold of the home she aggressively tried to steal from me just 2 weeks ago. I stood perfectly still, watching her pathetic tears fall onto the concrete driveway. I thought about the years of systematic emotional abuse, the constant gaslighting, and the cruel coordinated attempts to keep me subjugated beneath her fragile ego. I looked at the woman who slept with my husband and tried to orchestrate my total financial ruin. I did not feel any anger anymore, and I certainly did not feel any pity. I felt absolutely nothing at all. I reached out my hand toward the glowing security panel, staring directly at her weeping face through the camera lens. I did not say a single word to her. I simply pressed my index finger firmly against the glowing red button labeled "Deny Entry," cutting off the audio feed and leaving her entirely alone outside my impenetrable walls. The crisp morning wind swept across the expansive limestone balcony of my Buckhead estate, carrying the faint scent of Georgia pines and absolute victory. I stood perfectly still, resting my hands against the cool stone railing, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a brilliant golden light across the towering glass skyscrapers in the distance. Down below, the massive iron gates of my $4 million property stood firmly closed, securing my sanctuary. There was no screaming sister begging on the pavement. There were no manipulative parents demanding my compliance. There was no slick ex-husband trying to steal my algorithms. The toxic noise that had suffocated my entire existence for 34 years was completely and permanently eradicated. The silence surrounding me was not empty. It was heavy with absolute untouchable power. A soft melodic chime echoed from the smart home control panel mounted on the brick wall behind me. It was the specific audio tone I had programmed exclusively for approved VIP entry. The heavy security gates at the base of the driveway hummed to life, sliding open to admit a sleek black town car. I did not need to check the security monitors to know exactly who was arriving. I turned away from the skyline and walked back through the open glass French doors, stepping into the cavernous master suite of my home. My bare feet moved silently across the heated hardwood floors as I made my way toward the grand curving staircase. I descended the marble steps just as my lead corporate attorney, Jordan, walked through the heavy front doors. He was not carrying his usual battered briefcase or his serious courtroom expression. Today, Jordan was wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit with a genuine relaxed smile, completely transforming his usually tense features. In his right hand, he carried an ice bucket containing a chilled bottle of extremely rare vintage champagne. In his left hand, he held a single slender leather presentation folder. "Good morning, CEO," he said, his voice echoing brightly off the vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. "I brought breakfast." I smiled, walking across the pristine marble floor to meet him. "I see you brought the good stuff, Jordan. I assume this means the board members in Tokyo finally signed the secondary addendums." Jordan set the silver ice bucket down on the massive granite kitchen island and popped the golden wire cage off the champagne cork. He looked up at me with eyes full of absolute professional awe. "They did not just sign the secondary addendums, Sloan. The international property development conglomerate completely bypassed the licensing phase. They held an emergency shareholder meeting at midnight our time. They want to fully merge our domestic predictive algorithms with their global infrastructure network." I leaned against the edge of the kitchen island, watching him carefully. I asked him what the final valuation numbers were looking like for the proposed merger. Jordan pulled the leather folder open and slid a crisp white financial summary sheet across the smooth stone counter. He told me the Tokyo executives had authorized a preliminary baseline valuation of $1.2 billion for my real estate technology firm. He explained that they were offering me a permanent seat on their global executive board and absolute operational control over all North American tech development. The $80 million deposit from last week was literally just a down payment to secure their exclusive negotiating rights. The paper sitting in front of me represented the official transition from a successful local startup into a massive global technology empire. I looked down at the staggering sequence of zeros printed on the page. The sheer magnitude of the wealth was almost difficult to comprehend, but my heart maintained a perfectly steady rhythm. I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt completely prepared. I reached out and tapped the document, asking Jordan what the timeline looked like for the regulatory approvals. He smoothly popped the champagne cork, letting a soft wisp of white vapor escape into the quiet kitchen. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into two tall crystal flutes, telling me the Federal Trade Commission had already expedited the preliminary review process. But then his smile widened into something much more deeply satisfying. He handed me a glass and told me there was one final piece of local housekeeping to review before we took the company global. Jordan took a sip of his drink and explained that the liquidators handling Preston's disgraced hedge fund had officially finalized the asset seizure. Since my holding company was the sole owner of the catastrophic $12 million debt portfolio, we were given absolute first right of refusal on the liquidated capital. Jordan told me that the federal courts had completely dismantled the fraudulent charity foundation my parents used to launder their dirty money. The state had frozen the remaining clean funds and was desperately looking for a reputable community leader to take over the distribution of the grants meant for underprivileged youth in the city. I took a slow sip of the cold, crisp champagne, letting the sweet taste linger on my tongue. I told Jordan to draft the necessary legal petitions immediately. I instructed him to use the funds we recovered from Preston's liquidated hedge fund to completely endow a brand new independent philanthropic trust. I wanted the new foundation structured with absolute bulletproof transparency, governed by an external board of trusted community educators, and completely shielded from any elite socialite influence. We were going to take the dirty money my family tried to use to destroy me, and we were going to use it to actually build the community centers they had falsely promised to the city of Atlanta. Jordan raised his glass to me, his expression full of profound respect. He told me it was a brilliant strategic move that would completely erase the corrupt legacy of my parents, while permanently establishing my own name as a pillar of genuine integrity in the financial sector. He set his empty glass on the counter and buttoned his navy suit jacket, telling me he had a private jet waiting at the regional airport. He needed to fly to New York immediately to file the merger paperwork with the federal regulators before the weekend markets closed. I walked him back to the grand foyer, thanking him for his unwavering loyalty and his brilliant legal maneuvering over the past brutal weeks. Jordan paused with his hand on the heavy brass doorknob, looking back at me standing in the center of my massive, beautiful home. He told me it had been the absolute privilege of his entire career to watch me dismantle the people who tried to bury me. He stepped out into the bright morning sun, closing the door firmly behind him. I was completely alone again. But the house did not feel empty. It felt completely alive, vibrating with the limitless potential of the future I had viciously fought to protect. I walked back up the sweeping marble staircase, carrying my crystal flute of champagne. I moved through the sunlit corridors until I reached the master suite, stepping back out onto the expansive limestone balcony. The morning air had grown slightly warmer, carrying the deep, rich energy of the bustling city below. I stood at the stone railing, looking out over the endless canopy of green trees and the towering glass structures of the Atlanta skyline. I thought about the terrified, weeping woman I used to be standing in a divorce court watching my own sister commit perjury to steal my livelihood. I thought about the desperation I used to feel constantly begging for a single ounce of validation from parents who only valued my proximity to white institutional wealth. I thought about how easily they had all assumed I would just lie down and let them strip mine my entire existence to save their fragile, fabricated social status. They had severely underestimated the fundamental difference between a woman who inherits her power and a woman who forges it in the dark. They relied on old money connections and country club whispers to build their fragile paper castles. I relied on raw, relentless intellect and an absolute refusal to be completely erased from my own life story. I had not just survived being the designated family scapegoat. I had meticulously, mathematically dismantled the entire corrupt system that tried to bury me deep in the dirt. I had taken their deceit, their extortion, and their blatant federal crimes and weaponized every single mistake they made to construct a billion-dollar global empire. The wind picked up slightly, tossing my hair gently around my shoulders. I looked down at the massive iron security gates separating my pristine sanctuary from the chaotic, toxic world outside. Those gates were no longer just a physical barrier. They were a permanent, absolute boundary against anyone who believed they were entitled to my energy, my wealth, or my forgiveness. The blood running through our veins meant absolutely nothing when that same blood was used to justify profound psychological abuse and staggering financial betrayal. Family is an accident of biology. Respect is the only currency I accept at my front door. I raised my crystal glass to the beautiful sprawling skyline of the city I now completely owned. I took a sweet, victorious sip of the cold vintage champagne, letting the total absolute freedom wash over my entire soul. Fade to black.